these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, folks. Your favorite podcast, and you should be giving it 5 stars because it's your favorite podcast. It's called Hold These Truths. Now, we're having a very topical discussion today because, as you well know, Pope Francis recently passed away. Now, anytime a pope dies, it triggers a series of events. But what are they, and why are they done, and why are they done in the way they are? There's a lot of tradition and mystery and interest surrounding these processes, and that's why they're the focus of Hollywood, as recently seen in the movie Conclave, Angels and Demons, or the Netflix show, what is it, Borgias? Mm-hmm. They show a level of intrigue and backroom politicking, but what's really happening in the Sistine Chapel come May 7th? Now, with Pope Francis's passing the day after Easter, there's been more coverage, reporting, and interest in them as well. Here today to talk to us about what happens during the conclave is an expert from Catholic University of America, Dr. Joseph Capizzi, Dean of Theology and Religious Studies. He's been making the media rounds, and he's here with us today to shed light on the process. So, Dr. Capizzi, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure to join you.
So, let's, I guess, get started with the basics. You're a practicing Catholic.
I am.
You know this well enough. My wife is the same. I was married in the Catholic tradition, although I didn't grow up with Catholic.
Congrats.
And I've been told that my daughter will be raised Catholic. So so that's that. So what's the role of the Pope? Obviously, it's the only religion that has this. Well, it's not the Christian religion that has this head figure.
Right.
It's the oldest Christian religion. Am I correct?
Well, yeah. There are arguments about that a little bit. But
okay.
Yeah.
We could get into that. But, just generally speaking, I mean, why do they have a Pope?
Yeah. Great question. There's different pieces of an answer to that question. The first thing is that we believe the Pope is spoken of not by name, but in Scripture. When Jesus speaks to Peter in different ways about how Peter is different from the other apostles. He's the rock on which the church will be built. He has the keys, sort of like the juridical power, that Christ is handing over to Peter especially. He's the first among the apostles.
Interesting.
So, there's all this language that distinguishes Peter from among the others that indicates, we believe, that in a sense, he's first among equals.
Yeah.
And that's really what the Pope is. He's first among equals, the other equals being bishops. And so there's a governing authority within the Catholic Church.
I don't think a lot of people realize that there's some biblical text that actually led into this.
That's correct. So sometimes some of the Protestant criticism of the papacy might in fact be around.
Surprises Peter because he's just so slow. I mean, compared to John.
You mean, why is it Peter that Jesus chooses? It's a great question.
I'm making a joke. Here.
Okay.
Am I getting that right? It was Peter and John, right? Yeah, in John 20, the resurrection, and then John is, of course, writing the account of the resurrection, and has to note that the other disciple got there first.
Right.
The other disciple being John, who is writing this account. And I just think it's hilarious that he's like, well, I just had to tell everybody that I beat Peter. I beat him he's just slower. I beat him.
Competition among the apostles is probably related to conversation we'll have soon in a few minutes about the way the bishops relate to each other, right? People compete with each other. That's human beings, human nature. That's right.
But Jesus has designated Peter as
and Catholics claim that there are scriptural foundations for this, even though, of course, other Christians will say, where do you get this papacy thing? And we'll say right there, in the words that Jesus uses about the distinctiveness of Peter. But he also serves as in a governing role. That's part of what the Pope does. The church is a governed institution. I think a lot of people don't realize this. It has its own body of law, right? The Vatican City is, a political entity. It's not simply a spiritual entity.
Right.
There are laws and there is governance within the church, and the Pope is the head of the governance of the church, both spiritually and also temporally or practically.
Yeah.
So he does a lot, and he's a sign of unity as well. That's one of the big marks. Sometimes people get drawn into the Catholic Church because of the Pope as a symbol of unity. When we have arguments about, what do we think about this kind of question? We have a means of deciding this in the Catholic Church that is not always available to other communities.
But Catholics, though, you know what you're getting every time you go to Mass. It's very specific, and
the sacrament, and you're getting the sacrament, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the real thing there, however good or bad the homily is I got the body of Christ. I received the body of Christ. That's what we are getting. And that's, ultimately why we go to Mass and why there's a kind of uniformity to the practice. And you might come out complaining about Father so-and-so's homily, which becomes just, it's a little bit of sport, right? We can, over breakfast or
the
whatever.
homily is that's the part where they're supposed to, where they talk.
Yeah, but the important...
That's what we're used to in maybe a more Methodist congregation,
Yeah. But the important thing is the sacrament,
So the politics of it is interesting. I mean, like you said, it's technically its own sovereign country.
It is, correct.
And so, but that's one way of saying it. But how politicized or political is the papacy, or how political has it become? Like, what's the history of that? I mean, it used to be obviously quite a powerful political force in Europe.
Sure.
I'm sure that's changed over time, but it's not as if it's not as if Pope Francis didn't speak on politics on a regular basis.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And in history, popes were politically more impactful than they are now. So there are famous instances in history where emperors will go and basically walk through the snows on their knees, begging forgiveness from the Holy Father, because they're in danger of being excommunicated from the church for something that they've done and that was wrong. And those days are long gone. And really, since the French Revolution, there's been a kind of laicization of many of the states that used to have a kind of fusion of the Catholic faith with their own governments, and then the Pope would play a more outsized political role. So since that time, and really since about the early 20th century, popes have been more like sort of public figures from a moral perspective, kind of enjoining better treatment of human beings through different ways. Like, let's treat each other better.
Lead by inspiration, not by authority.
Yeah, and maybe moral exhortation, even like a kind of, look, politicians, you can do better with regard to this or that question. And like you said, Francis was not afraid to do this. John Paul II famously challenging the communist government in Poland.
Right,
as
that
Pope.
example. Massively influential.
So they can have that kind of force which very few other religious figures can have. And there's something about being a juridical thing, being in their own state, that kind of allows that, gives it a little bit more gravity.
And just, before we get into the how we choose a new one, I mean, what was Pope Francis's general outlook? I mean, he's accused of being too liberal in some places, but also maintaining the traditions in others. What's sort of the base, maybe not your take, you don't have to give your opinion on it, or you can, but the different sides of the arguments on his legacy.
So I think the first thing that people should be aware of is that by definition the papacy is a conservative institution, right? The Catholic Church is a conservative institution
in the sense that it's designed to conserve the tradition.
Right. There's a tradition that
small c conservative.
Yeah, there's a tradition that we're trying to hand on and have an obligation to hand on. So the arguments about how liberal this or that pope is or whatever, they're always a little bit skewed already, because even Francis was coming from a kind of conservative posture. We have a tradition. It's a valuable thing. I need to shepherd it and hand it on forward to the next person. I think in terms of his disposition, he was much more a person concerned about almost like the physical level of human interaction and things that might be obstacles to that, whether it's becoming too intellectual, too almost like impractically spiritual or something. Francis just wanted and exhorted us all to kind of engage each other as people with much less pretense than may have been the case in the past.
Speaking a little bit more layman's terms than biblical terms, is that
right? And so sometimes he would say things like, "Look, let's stop navel gazing about doctrine. right? Which, if you're somebody like me who I study doctrine, that's what I do for my living, you're kind of like, wait a minute, like doctrine's important.
What do you mean by that? Yeah, because it sounds like you're trying to get away from tradition.
Correct. And doctrine is teaching, and it's just the Latin rooted word for teaching. Teaching matters. And I don't think he meant it didn't matter, but he did mean we're obsessing about it and we're starting to lose contact with people who ought to first just be encountering Christ. So I think he really did have this kind of pastoral instinct that the first move needs to be engaging with people, especially those on, he used the term peripheries, right? Like the edges of society who are there for very different reasons. They could be criminals, they could be migrants, they could be the disabled, they could be the elderly, right? They could be the unborn, right? There are people who are out there on the edges of society, and the center is kind of comfortable. And he was always challenging us to get uncomfortable, right? And go out to these kinds of people, which is why, he did some things sort of famously or symbolically to suggest even the Pope needs to do this: washing the feet of the homeless, visiting criminals, moving out of the papal palace.
I mean, he was one of the interesting things about his papacy was this. He didn't just say those things, right? He lived by it. He lived in a different apartment. That's not the
right,
like the I don't know,
not as palatial as the other
whatever
residence.
The other one is.
Yeah.
Dressed differently, the rings he wore, the pendant he wore, or the cross he wore was not the normal ornate one.
Right.
So he wanted to symbolize, I guess, this different approach.
Yeah, even his name, right? Taking the name of Francis. It's the first time a pope took Francis, and it exhibits his own.
The first Francis.
He's the first He's the first pope as Francis, and it exhibits his own devotion to and attraction to Saint Francis, who's rather famous for getting rid of all of his wealth, sort of walking away from family wealth, embracing poverty, and founding a community that wanted, itself to embrace poverty. So all of this was.
What is like the list? Does it have to be a saint when you choose a name? This is a question coming from the
Yeah,
non-Catholics.
listen, honestly, I don't know if it has to be a saint.
How does the name choosing happen?
The Pope chooses it on his own.
Could you choose like Charles, or I don't know, like Dan? Well, no, that's even
LeBron.
Yeah, something random. Yeah, because like Daniel's still.
I suspect.
Has there been a Pope Daniel?
Not that I'm aware of. I suspect that. Yeah,
one day.
Yeah. Well, maybe after this podcast, they'll feel the influence.
Maybe they'll think about it. So there's not like a set of rules about how that name is chosen?
There may very well be rules about it. I honestly just don't know that.
Interesting.
It's funny. It's a question I've never even sort of asked myself. But the point is, he was drawn to the poverty of St. Francis. And so from the very first moment that he was asked, will you consent to being the Pope? And saying yes, he had in mind a move of stripping away a lot of the fashion and pretenses associated with maintaining the tradition still, right? But trying to get rid of some of the stuff that maybe looked like it distanced the Pope from really what is his mission, which is serving the church, right? He's the servant of servants is another name for the Pope, the servus servorum, the servant of the servants. And that was something that I think he embraced as well.
You can go back in time a little bit. How was he chosen? I mean, we're talking about how the next pope will be chosen and the process is there. Looking at some history, what brought him to that stage in hindsight?
Yeah, and so again, the process is secretive. So a lot of what we know about this is based in, gossip, people talking about it afterwards. He apparently was a candidate when Pope Benedict was elected. He was somebody that was thought of as a kind of live alternative at the time when Pope Benedict became Pope. And then I think there's some thought that after then Jorge Bergoglio lost, that's his name before he became Pope Francis. After he lost, that might have been his moment. Maybe his moment had passed. Of course, Pope Benedict resigns, which is unprecedented, hadn't happened for roughly half a millennium.
Wow.
Right? Popes don't resign, or even more than that, longer than that. So popes don't resign. Pope Benedict steps down, and now all of a sudden the candidate who was a live candidate before, who people thought, well, his time has come and gone, all of a sudden he becomes a kind of live candidate. And because the church has become increasingly global in terms of the cardinals are the guys who vote on this, and more of them are not from Europe, from Africa, Asia, Latin America. There was, a sense that this is where the church needs to go.
Why do you think that is? What's the reasoning behind that? Is it just
why are there more?
Yeah, is it just because a more secular Europe is on trend? And
that's a part of it. Yeah, for sure. There's fewer and fewer priests coming out of Europe, and the church is most vibrant in Africa. Africa is the place where the Catholic Church is growing the fastest. I think the largest Catholic population, if I remember correctly, is in the Congo, and
I would not have
or
guessed
maybe
that.
the fastest growing. It's one of those two, and it's also where it's the youngest.
Right.
The church is old in Europe,
Because I mean, like
young
the entire continent of South America is pretty much Catholic, right? Pretty much.
It is, but that's diminishing. In fact, evangelical churches, the Mormons and others have gained ground. Of course, secularizing tendencies have gained ground over time. But Asia's another place where there's growth, especially Southeast Asia. Vietnam is a place where there's a lot of growth in Catholicism.
What do you think draws people to Catholicism versus another denomination? What do you think it is that the Catholics are doing right to be expanding in some of these places? Is it just doing the job of actually going on the mission? Because it's not like Mormons aren't trying all the time.
Well, look, I think there's a lot of growth among the faiths in these parts of the world. And when Catholicism is successful, there's, I think, a few reasons. One is, like you're saying, they're just doing a lot of good work. So a lot of really good, like high schools in the Philippines and other places.
Actual practical work.
Are run
and
by...
they have the resources to do it.
They're run...
Maybe unlike some other...
they're run by religious orders typically. So like there'll be Jesuit high schools or Redemptorist high schools, orders that will run schools. And schools have... in history, whether it's in the United States or in the Philippines or Vietnam or wherever else, vocations come out of these high schools. Cardinal Gregory, who just stepped down as the Cardinal of Washington, D.C., he came out of Chicago. And if I remember correctly, he was trained in a Catholic high school in inner city Chicago as a young black kid. And so it's just access, doing these things, bringing education. And then, of course,
a couple thousand years of infrastructure being built.
And the tradition, like you said before. Like
people are attracted to, like, look, this is what it is. I can wrap my head around that. There's not a lot of... The Catholics don't give you a lot of space to, like, interpret how you want to kneel and stand, right?
Well, and also, we're seeing this even in the United States among young men, which is interesting. There's a kind of... The people who are coming into the church are young men. And it also gives you purpose, right? There's a sense of, now somebody's answering, why are you here, right? Which is a question that our culture, if we both know, right? Like American society is struggling to answer that kind of question for young men in particular, but young people. Why am I here?
It's very much a larger problem.
It's a huge problem. And the church gives you an answer. Well, God created you out of love, and he's given you a purpose. Your purpose is to love other people, to share the love that you've been given with other people. You don't even earn it, right? Like a key element of our teaching is this is love you didn't earn. Yeah. Right. And a lot of us
confusing, but it's important.
Because a lot of us, if you look at yourself, you're kind of like, look, what have I done to deserve what I got? You know, and gratitude's a big part of this.
Yeah, it is. Real quick, I want to go back to something you said about the history of the papacy and how, again, like emperors would crawl on their knees to gain the affection or gain the penance, whatever it is. That just, it's not that way anymore. But in those times, it feels antithetical to the entire purpose of Jesus's teachings and Christianity. Because to me, Christianity was the ultimate moment where humanity moved toward equality. Because you think of and this is what Jesus was rebelling against, this idea that the priest class was in charge, and you had to ask them, you had no access to God, only they did, and very hierarchical structure, and he's, Jesus said, no, God lives within you. You get to have that relationship with God on a very personal level. So that's empowering, And and eventually, I think that's what led to your dissertation, your doctoral dissertation on slavery. I think that's what ultimately leads, and of course the abolitionists would make biblical arguments about even though there's slavery mentioned in the Bible over and over, they're still using the teachings of Jesus to argue against slavery,
to free people. Yeah,
and so and so how do you square that circle, I guess, with that authoritarian style pope back in the day?
Right. I mean, I guess to some extent, what I would do is I'd say it wasn't authoritarian, right? And go back to, like I said really quickly, the Latin phrase. One way of describing the pope is the servus servorum. And that's the Latin word for servant, right? Or even slave, the servant of the servants. In fact, the Pope is supposed to be almost like the most debased of all of us. And the fact is he's not, right? I mean, this would be the criticism. He's not. He flies first class, or whatever. And one of Pope Francis's concern was something he identified as clericalism. What has happened, instead of serving as priests, instead of serving as bishops, instead of serving as the Pope, we look like we've just assumed a kind of royal role. Yeah. And so he wanted to be critical of that and wanted the church to recognize that her primary mission is one of service, and we need to sort of strip that away as much as possible. Now, on the other hand, it is also, like I said before, it is also an institution. It's a state in a sense. And so there is a kind of governing authority that he possesses. So when the Pope is asking the emperor, or the emperor feels himself the need to go bow before the Pope is, the rationalization there would be, he's not bowing before me, he's bowing before Christ, right? I am bringing symbolic Christ to this moment. And this is where this emperor or the sinner, you or I, actually can free ourselves by this submission of ourselves to Christ, not to the man.
It's the idea of the confession.
That's right.
Which doesn't really exist in that form in other denominations.
That's right. It's not to the man, Pope Francis. It's to this bearer of Christ into this moment. That is what we're supposed to be submitting ourselves to. And, we claim every knee will bend, right, before Christ, the priest, prophet, and king. And so that's the idea. But in practice, too often, people can be themselves seduced by the power that's associated with the thing and distort it, and make it about themselves.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay, so let's talk about what happened when the Pope dies.
Okay, sure.
So
yeah. No problem.
So it happened. What happens next? What's the Camerlengo?
The Camerlengo is essentially like the head administrator for the Pope. This is this Cardinal Farrell, who actually used to be here in D.C. He's
like the chief of staff.
Basically like his chief of staff. And he confirms the Pope's death, and then also sets in motion all of the processes that are kind of just click into motion upon the death of the Pope. Most of us just watched this play out over time. So there was the viewing right after the confirmation of his death. We had the viewing of his body. And then
my chief of staff here he was actually there to go see it.
I know, which is amazing. And then Saturday was the funeral. And then, he was interred in Rome in a church again, which was not typical for the popes, but there are a couple of other popes.
That was going to be my question. So in his will or whatever.
He specified. He specified where he wanted to be buried or laid to rest.
Is there a place where normally they're all buried?
There is, but he chose again to do something that was important to him, and there's apparently an icon in this church that he prayed to often, and he wanted to be buried there. And there are a couple of other popes who were there, so it's not unprecedented for him to be there. Okay. And then once the funeral ends, we enter into this period of mourning, the 9 days of mourning, and after which we go to the exciting movie subject, the conclave, which we've been given a date, May 7th. Yep. That's when the conclave will begin, and it'll begin with a mass. Between now and then, between now and the beginning of the conclave.
And it's sort of chaired or led by the bishop you mentioned, his chief of staff, right?
Yeah, the Camerlengo.
Yeah.
I think so. Honestly, I don't remember. I don't even.
In the movie, The Conclave, I didn't finish it, so I was going to ask your opinion on it. But there was somebody who was clearly in charge of at least like managing the votes.
There is,
right?
yeah. The church is really good at managing things,
Right.
in some ways, and this is the sort of thing it's very good at. Yeah. So.
You figure it out after a couple thousand
And if
years.
people have not been to the Vatican City, right? So you go to Rome, you're in a city, and it's a little bit like it's almost like entering Central Park, right? Like it's a place within a place, except it's behind walls. So you go into the Vatican City, and to demystify it, I've been there myself. I've stayed in the Vatican City. I think I even stayed in Casa Santa Maria, which is where this will all take place. Which is it's like most tourists, travelers will think of it as a kind of B-level hotel. It's nothing special.
So what takes place there?
This is where the conclave will be. I mean, or where they will be staying while they're at the conclave.
Got it.
Yeah. The conclave
was in the Sistine Chapel.
It is in the Sistine Chapel, right? But this is where they're staying. I'm just like trying to like put you there in a sense. It's just
in the movie. I don't remember the Sistine Chapel. Again, I didn't finish.
I didn't see it.
You didn't see
I didn't
Conclave?
see it. No, they're there. They should be in there. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, great. I was going to ask you what you thought about Conclave, but it got mixed reviews. I started watching some of it on the plane, but
I mean, once I read about the ending, I was like, do I really want to see this?
I heard. You know? Yeah, I heard it. Don't tell me.
I won't tell you about it.
I heard it was controversial.
Yeah, and it's like I don't want to like. I mean, we're going to get off on something else. I just don't want to see another movie where, the
You're
church
trying
is
to bash the church.
Yeah, the church is made to look either foolish or like sinister. And it's neither of those things. I wish it were that interesting. You know, it's just, it's
it has
not.
people in it, and people are sinners and not perfect. Like
That's just like any institution. And again, like to put you there, the cardinals are all there. They're in this B-level hotel. They're eating B-level food together. Many of them are getting to know each other for the first time. So they've been there since the funeral, or they're just arriving. And they're having these things called general congregations. This is where a lot of the work gets done. I'm sure there's something similar to this here in Congress.
Now?
This is happening now.
Yeah, so they're just doing all this kind of work up to the...
Getting to know each other.
So is May 7th like the first vote?
May 7th will be the first time they vote. They'll vote that afternoon.
So
correct.
Prior to that, they're conversing. Some are politicking, right?
If we all remember Backroom Politics, right?
Yeah,
those days, and where
guys vote counts. Feels very similar to my.
Guys will get together and they'll talk about stuff, and they'll say like, "Are you going to get behind so and so?" And you'll be like, "No, I'm not going to get behind him. He's an idiot, and here's why he's an idiot," and or whatever. Like, there's a lot of that kind of conversation happening. Who are we going to get behind? What do we want to see happen? Where should the church be headed? Should we get another Italian in? Right?
Last time there wasn't Italian.
The last time there was Italian was John Paul I. So it was, that was 78 when John Paul II was elected, the first non-Italian in, again, like a half a millennium, 400 and something years. John Paul II of Pole is elected, then you get a German, and then you get the Argentinian. So, I mean, that's going to be a conversation.
Yeah.
Should we return it to, Italian?
That affects their votes, like what's the region.
For sure.
Regional diversity.
I imagine again in Congress in the cafeteria when you guys get together, the Texans, get together sometimes, and the guys from the South get together or whatever. Like these things happen, and so there's no mystery with regard to the way human beings are going to politic this, which I think is fair to say.
In the movie, is if you didn't watch the movie, but that
I'll watch it. I'll commit myself to that.
That's what it was. It was, they were. I don't know where they were hanging out. It felt like they were in some like rundown cafeteria.
It could be Casa Santa Maria, which
it might have just been there. Yeah. That's what they were trying to.
I've been there for conferences, and so what happens is.
But they were voting, and they were definitely not in the Sistine Chapel. I think that would have been obvious in the movie. I don't know. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
But the point is, there was a lot of what you're describing. It was a lot of politicking. It was like, okay, who's a supporter here? Okay, how are we gonna? We really don't like that guy, so maybe I need to drop out. So it's just like any race that you see in politics.
Yeah, that's right. And that's as Catholics, we believe the Holy Spirit is animating this, but the Holy Spirit operates through human instruments, right? I mean, this is how this works, right?
Yeah.
Is that human beings getting together are kind of like,
Your consciousness is in effect. The Holy Spirit.
So these congregations are very important. They'll be sorting through these kinds of things, and I'm sure already they're making decisions about this guy seems, not really a candidate. This guy we thought might be turns out to be less charismatic than we thought he was. Maybe he's the wrong guy. Do we want a more muted papacy, for instance? All of these kinds of things are going to be discussed, and I'm sure are getting discussed right now before May 7th when they vote for the first time that afternoon, and almost certainly will not elect the Pope.
I just had this in my notes. What's the sede vacante?
Sede vacante is the period we're in right now. It just is Latin for an empty seat.
Got it.
Right?
Got it.
The seat of St. Peter, the papal seat, right now is empty.
So then they have the conclave is technically the May 7th event.
Correct.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
And it comes from this Latin word conclavian. It means a room that can be locked up.
Yes.
So high amount of secrecy in there. So let's talk about maybe so who's in there. This is interesting. I have in my notes. Only cardinals under the age of 80 are permitted to vote.
Correct.
Where'd they come up with that number? Why is that?
It's just the sort of decision you make in the way like insurers might make decisions and so on. It's just like there's just a notion at some point you become perhaps less sharp, less involved in the politics or whatever. I think in the future we might see that even pushed up a little bit for different reasons. That's the sort of thing that it's not like dogma. That's just a kind of bureaucratic decision. Not every cardinal ought to be electing. There's some point at which you just reach a certain stage in life where you're just not as capable. Maybe you're more persuadable even, right? Like I have elderly, an elderly mother, my in-laws, you're not your own person in the same way you were before.
Yeah.
And I think that's partly what's
why they do it.
They're really concerned about influence, people being influenced.
So there's 252 cardinals worldwide, but only 135 are eligible to vote.
Correct.
So is that just because of age? Or
it is.
Is there any other reason you wouldn't be eligible?
No, it's about your age. I think 133 will be present and voting. I think there are 2 people who, for illness, I believe, will not be showing up at the conclave.
So how does this actually go down? They show up to the Sistine Chapel. Are they like filling out ballots?
They are.
How exactly?
I understand that the movie represents that pretty well. That they present the ballot and each person individually walks up and places their ballot in a box or a vessel of some sort and makes a kind of statement of this is my vote and I vote before God, and returns to their seat, and they all do that. And they have as many as I think maybe 3 votes a day, no more than that per day.
And you need 60 or 80%.
They need 2/3.
2/3. Okay. 2/3 majority to get there. What's the longest it's ever taken?
That I don't know. That's a good question. It's been pretty quick recently.
Yeah.
I don't think this one will be quick.
There was one that was like years, but that was like 1,000 years ago.
Look, in the modern papacy, it's pretty well done. It's pretty efficient.
Yeah. Was it always done this way?
No.
When did the tradition start?
I don't know exactly when the tradition started, but it's...
My understanding is it actually started based on that instance I'm talking about. We did a quick podcast about it. There was an instance, I don't know, like 13th century. Took years to do it, so I think after that they established the tradition.
That makes sense that they would want a speedier process than that, right? The sede vacante, that's a little long for that.
How do they enforce this sense of secrecy? Is there a way to enforce it?
Sure. I mean, number one. You hold each other accountable. Again, I'm sure like you do in Congress, right? I mean, the best way to do that sort of thing is you have to have certain personalities that are forceful enough, to make other people accountable.
So say a cardinal goes and talks to a reporter, gives them some insight.
So they are secluded. This is the idea of the conclave. Is they're secluded.
They don't have any phones on them.
They are not supposed to leave. They don't have their phones. They're not supposed to have contact with anybody other than the people who serve them while they're there. And there are those people, nuns serve priests and bishops all over the world.
Yeah.
There will be nuns there who will be serving them. They are supposed to be we keep using the phrase secrecy, everybody, and making it sound again like it's mystery. It's not. It's just the idea is you want people secluded from
It's like a jury.
outside forces, so they're not influenced by them. Right? Exactly like a jury. That's right. it's a really good comparison because you don't want somebody.
But if a
calling
juror, breaks that rule, they get kicked off the jury. And is there a mechanism again, when there's a will, there's a way. It might be difficult to go talk to reporters, but when there's a will, there's a way. They'll figure it out. Will they be kicked off the?
Well, they can be excommunicated.
Yeah,
In fact, the punishment for this is grave. Which is separation from the church.
It's not just kicked out of the conclave.
No, it's actually So it is grave, and again, that's why I think like the key feature is holding each other accountable, taking seriously their own laws and commitments. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So, do you have any predictions?
Let's go back to a point that we discussed earlier, and that is how diverse the cardinals have become over time, right? And this is something you probably have read. Pope Francis elevated most of these men to cardinal status.
Interesting.
And he did this in a manner that was departed from some norms. So, for instance, the current Archbishop of Los Angeles is not a cardinal. And almost every other time, the Archbishop of Los Angeles has been a cardinal. So he passed over that Archbishop and named people in smaller places cardinals. And he's named a lot of cardinals from Africa, Asia, the Americas, atypical places. So there's a good chance that will inform who the next pope is, just if you think about predictions.
Just
right?
because who's there. Okay.
Well, just because you're going to get guys who, they're not as many Europeans. So if there's this desire to bring it back to Europe and have a European pope or even an Italian pope, they just don't have the same numbers that they used to have. They'd have to make a different kind of case in order to make that sort of appeal. There are people that people talk about as papabile is a term, which means like sort of popeable. There are some people that people point to. One is an alumnus of my own university, Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines is somebody that people point to as a potential, papabile, somebody who might be. But I just think I think if there's a prediction, the longer it goes, the less likely it's somebody that anybody's identifying as a kind of papabile. The longer it goes, the more likely it's a wild card. The shorter it is, you're probably going to come out with somebody like a Parolin, who's somebody people have mentioned was an Italian cardinal. I don't know, there's some others, people. There are a couple of Americans.
Yeah.
Prevost, Cardinal Prevost is one. Cardinal Tobin is another from New Jersey. So there are a couple of American cardinals who, I could see the case for, and maybe they'll get around, get around behind them.
First time.
It would be the first time. I don't know if the world's ready for, President Trump plus an American pope. That would be a lot, on the
that would be a lot
on the global stage, right?
So let's talk about the black smoke and the white smoke. In 2005, the Vatican added a new way to announce a new pope. St. Peter's Basilica largest bell will ring. So how is this going to play out?
I didn't even know that. There's a bell. Look, the white smoke indicates we have a pope, right?
Yeah.
And that's the first sign. Will be the white smoke that every day we're gonna, if
the smoke always from burning the ballot because they burned the ballots
and they add something. They add a chemical to color it.
Black or white.
Exactly.
Is it environmentally friendly, the chemical? So Pope Francis had some concerns about that. I think that's an example, by the way, of where it's I wonder if you're stepping out of your lane here. And I think
we can talk about that if you'd like to in a little bit.
Criticism of Pope Francis.
Yeah, we could talk about that if you'd like. I have no problem talking about whether he was stepping out of his lane there, but. Is it environmentally friendly? I suspect it's not.
Smoke generally isn't.
Right.
But that's how it is.
Smoke generally isn't.
Yeah, but so they burn the ballots is there a specific reason or is it just tradition?
It's tradition, but also I think it's good bureaucratic practice.
It's
what
good
do you guys do?
as we would call it. Operational security.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right.
We'll see. Okay, so we get to that point. Maybe it happens on May 7th. What are the chances it actually happens?
Almost
zero.
impossible. Yeah,
How long did it
almost
take last
impossible.
time? Do you remember?
For Francis, I think it was just a couple of days. Yeah, I think it might have been the second day, but
Okay.
it was relatively quick.
Yeah.
And I don't think it'll be more than 3 days, but who knows?
Who knows? Who knows?
knows?
Well, we will be waiting with bated breath.
I want it to get done. To be honest.
Yeah, well, as a Catholic, I'm sure both Catholics want it done. I got to see Pope Francis last time I was in Rome. I thought that was pretty neat. We got to go to a mass.
Oh, good,
where he was
good.
at. My wife was super excited about it. I was excited about it.
Yeah.
It's something to see the Pope. I mean, people.
Did you actually get to shake his hand, like an
No,
audience kind of thing?
No,
No, just saw.
No, he was giving mass.
Hmm.
So we were somewhere in the back and saw him. Like that's.
I was at a conference in early December of this past year, and I got to shake his hand because he opened up the conference and welcomed everybody who was there. He was wheelchair bound at that point, but pretty vigorous, despite that. So the decline was relatively quick, obviously. Yeah.
Now you can't vote if you're. Last question: you can't vote if you're over 80, but can you be elected if you're over 80?
I think it's unlikely they would elect somebody that old.
But it's not against a rule.
Yeah, I don't know why. I don't know why it would be against that, but I'm pretty sure they're not looking for anybody that old. And that's another thing too, is that when people talk about like sort of who's popeable, it's not as mysterious as you think. Again, it'd be like in anything, you start looking at the age range. Well, do we really want to elect somebody? Like we did this in the United States recently, who's in his 80s? They're right. People decline abruptly when they're in their 80s. So probably not.
Or they're like Trump and they just keep going.
Or
on a diet at McDonald's and no sleep.
Right. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Or do you want to elect somebody who's 59? There are cardinals who are pretty young, and I don't know that anybody really wants to elect somebody for 30 years. So
Right.
You're probably looking at a window, let's say, of like 68 to 70, mid to late, mid 70s, and all of a sudden, the 133 gets reduced to, 40 or something, and then there are other reasons why you might reduce those numbers pretty. So it's not like it's a super guessing game. People go in, you have a sense of who's going to lead this committee or who's going to become the pope. It's just like that. It's not that mysterious.
Right. Well, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been our listeners will be more informed as May 7th approaches.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so.
All right. We'll end it there, but then I want to have a bonus round with a few other questions. Okay.
Happy to. Yep.
All right. So, but bonus round on Catholic traditions and such from our guest, Dr. Joseph Capizzi. Did I get that right?
You did. Well done.
God, jeez. What have some funner questions?
Sure.
You said you hadn't seen the Conclave, so we can't really talk about the accuracy.
I'll talk about it anyway.
But what about other movies like famous books like Angels and Demons? And the symbology surrounding the Vatican, and all this stuff and these ideas. What's the academic point of view on
Nonsense?
Just all of it's just nonsense.
Yeah.
Are they ever referencing something that's real, or is it just fiction?
I think they're typically fiction. There are certain things about the Catholic faith, really any faith, that make them seem exotic, right? Number one, we're an increasingly secular society, so just the fact that people sort of willingly believe certain things already seems exotic. Number two, in the case of Catholicism, you have a lot of the trappings of the faith that look ancient, right? They look bizarrely old, the way the men dress, the fact that Latin is spoken, which always ends up in featuring prominently in The Omen or these sorts of books. They're speaking Latin. There's something mysterious and secret about it.
Going on there.
And it's like, no, it's not mysterious and secret. It's a language, in fact, that there are still people alive who in England and elsewhere were trained in Latin as young people in school. It was a vibrant language, a kind of language of literature. So there are just certain features that make it seem exotic. And then there are in some cases, like the religious communities associated with these sorts of dramatizations, people think of them as secretive and conspiratorial. Like Opus Dei is sort of the object of the angels and demons. What is the other book that Dan Brown wrote?
The first one was Da
Da Vinci Code.
Yeah.
Right. And there's this tendency to make it seem super duper like sinister. And to the point you made earlier, it's just people. It's just people who are looking for something, and sometimes they find like a particular religious spirituality appeals to them. And so they enter into a community within Catholicism. Some lay Catholics become drawn to like lay Franciscan orders.
Is there an Illuminati?
I'm not allowed to answer that question.
God, yeah, I knew it.
Yeah. Not that I'm aware of. It could be to their credit that they never approached me about joining.
Well, it's like all the rumors about DC, the famous parties and whatnot. I'm like, where are these parties? And like, where is this crazy stuff that you're talking about happening? I'm not invited.
I think one of the things, if we're now talking about conspiracies, one of the things that I always use when I'm teaching, like just to caution young people about believing conspiracies is, do you know anybody who keeps a secret well?
Yeah.
Right?
That's why I tell everybody about government conspiracies.
Because I don't, right? And so if we have some, centuries old conspiracy, I can't figure out who these people are who are so good at keeping secrets, because everybody I know tells everything to everybody else. Right? That's my experience.
And if it's so secretive, it's hard to be powerful.
Yeah,
because to gain influence, you have to use communication,
right?
And so it's
and this even from the military, right? Even like in terms of keeping secrets within the military, you have to keep the circle super tight, right? Because you expand it even like one man, and it almost like exponentially increases the likelihood you can't control it, right?
Yeah.
So. Yeah, I'm not sympathetic to conspiracies, you could tell, and I don't think there are many or any, operating in the church.
Yeah. Well, your PhD dissertation focused on what was it called? It's called
the problem of slavery. Yeah.
The development of doctrine, the challenge of slavery to moral theology. So one of the things you said you study a lot is just the study of ethics and morality, and so
Correct.
It's kind of an interesting topic. So let me walk us through that.
Sure.
That entire dissertation in just a few minutes.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating for your listeners.
Yeah.
So So real quick, like the idea is the abolition of slavery happens very quickly in the West, and it happens very late, or another way to put it would be really recently. It's literally the 1800s, right, forward, when slavery gets abolished. And up until that point, most human beings thought slavery was a kind of unfortunate feature of life in human society. And as Christians, we would say human beings fell, right? They fell from grace, and we treat each other lousy. And there are institutions that bear the marks of the fall, and slavery is one of them. It's not in itself immoral. The question is, how do you treat those who are your slaves, right? Or what are the obligations and responsibilities masters and slaves have towards each other? That's how most people approach that question for much of human history. And at some point in the 1800s, maybe a little earlier, but not much, you get people saying, wait, that's not a good enough response to this question. It's not simply a problem of how people treat each other. It's the state itself, right? The state of one person owning another person, not merely like owning their labor, but owning the person. That's immoral. And so what I wanted to do was look at, number one, why did people think this for so long, that it was permissible? And number two, what's going on as they're changing their moral views towards this question, and in particular, the Catholic Church? Because the church is in the United States of America at that point, and there are bishops who are arguing on both sides of the abolition case. There's Bishop John England in South Carolina arguing there's nothing per se wrong with the domestic slavery system. We have to treat slaves better than they're being treated. He opened up schools for black children in South Carolina, which were burned down by, people who thought he was abolitionist, but he was clearly not. And then, of course, in the North, you had bishops saying, no, slavery's, well, some arguing in its defense, but some arguing in its favor. So that's what I'm looking at, is just sort of tracking that change over time to the late 1800s, where you have the church condemning slavery, and then again, it's more recently than we'd all think about. In the early 1900s, pretty forcefully saying it's immoral. So that was what I was looking at.
Well, did you come up with any answers? Is there any epiphanies as to is there any moments in time that caused that change in perception? And
I mean, the epiphany is not that there's a moment, but there are a lot of other variables that are going into this. One of the most important things is what you might even almost call like evolutionary theory with regard to societies themselves, that societies are evolving and progressing, and in some ways good and in some ways bad, but there is change. And for much of human history, people didn't think things changed like this. So even in the scriptures, if you go to the letter to Philemon, right, where Paul sends Onesimus back, right, and says, he's your brother. Treat him like a brother. He doesn't say he's manumitted. He doesn't say, he's freed from slavery. It's treat him like a brother. Most people think we're going to live with that institution. And you might even argue we still do, right? I mean, if you pay attention to human trafficking.
Well, in a lot of places, yeah. It's not like slavery's gone.
Yeah, right. That's right.
It's just not in vogue the way it used to be. It's not accepted.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a long, gradual process, and there's always regression.
Well, and I guess one of the your typical atheist would say, well, how can you believe in the Bible when it effectively condones slavery? What's the best argument against that?
Yeah, that's a really tough question, and you may know this, that one of the issues in the 19th century is especially the Protestant churches are splitting over this issue, right? So you get like the Southern Methodists splitting from the Northern Methodists and others precisely over this question. And there are good historians who've looked at this kind of question. Mark Knoll at Notre Dame was one of these guys. Used to be at Wheaton College. Part of what's happening is some of them, especially the abolitionist types, are detaching from Scripture. They're moving away from it and saying, basically, like, Scripture isn't very good on this question. Or the underlying principles of Scripture are anti-slavery, even though a lot of the language and the instances are not, are in fact more like, not pro-slavery, which is a technical term, but they're more like, look, slavery you're going to have with you. Right. So the scriptural thing here, you have to go to the freedom that Christ promises us. I mean, that's really the message. There's a message of freedom there, and it's delivered to us as individuals. Like
I said, it's the first form of equality that I think Western civilization.
Yeah, neither slave nor free. I mean, it's in there. Neither Greek nor Roman. Gentile. Gentile or Jew. Sorry, what am I talking about? Gentile or Jew, right? Slave nor free. Christ is coming to us as human beings, irrespective of our status, irrespective of, we would say today, our color, right? And so on. He offers something to you that liberates you. And then there's this, we would say, well, what really animates the global rights tradition, the freedoms that we all, value and want to defend and so on, is the scripture. It is that underlying message. And it just took a long time for the abolition of slavery to be possible and for people to recognize its possibility. But once it did, like I said, it happens in about a 70-year period. Very quickly, it collapses throughout the West. but that's driven by Christians. It's delivered by, you know, abolitionist British Christians and others, you know.
In my counter argument is always, well, you know, it's condoning is a strong word to say that the Bible condones slavery. I mean, it's written in a time where it is an institution that it simply exists.
It looks eternal.
Just as bread exists, you
That's
know,
right.
and like we can find out, look, bread is bad for you now. We know that, but you know, it's just
I love
because
bread.
I know it's got gluten and stuff, and it's just too many bad carbs. Anyway, you know,
I'm anti-gluten.
The point is you know, it's you have to take everything into context, the lens of that time, and they're describing a world they live in, and
That's right.
What you have to do is, like as you said, you know, focus on the underlying moral foundations that Christ teaches, and that eventually we, as fallen humans, figure out.
That's right.
Eventually get better at. And like our own founding is similar, right? The Declaration of Independence is, and the Constitution itself is, you know, it's very much an abolitionist document. And the founders had that problem where they were like,
Right.
we can't write it too hard, but if we write these words, I think eventually people have to go back to these words and say, like, we can't have slavery because we said it in the Declaration. We laid out our principles very firmly from the beginning.
Right. They're liberating principles,
yeah.
right, ultimately. And it just takes time to play it out. And we also, look, if you know yourself, right, what you're always invited to do is explore yourself. You just know, like, look, I'm fallible and I favor myself, you know, all the time. And people just, they don't want to see things that challenge them. And that was part of what was happening for a long, long time.
It was interesting. I know we've gone over your time, and I appreciate it. Thanks for the
My
bonus
pleasure.
round,
Yeah.
Doctor. It's great to have you.
Anytime.
right.
Thank you for everything that you do.
Thanks. All right, that's a wrap.